Okay, I just discovered my master's thesis is in 3 academic libraries around the world. It's in Bayreuth, Germany, Oregon, and Michigan. And I made booklets at Kinko's back in 2000 when I did my master's thesis 25 years ago. So kind of happy that I have no idea how they got in those libraries, but somehow things things get shuffled around by civilization. And I just want to thank people for taking interest in my recent videos, citing a Greek professor of philosophy of science on the connection between noncommutativity and the Fourier time frequency uncertainty principle in science. And it's very fascinating to me that radians is considered to be unitless, no unit. So in my master's thesis, I think it was in my master's thesis, I cite these philosophy professors, Philip Hugley and Charles Sayward. Their article, Did the Greeks Discover the Irrational? That was published in 1999 in a philosophy in the journal called Philosophy. And they say no, the Greeks did not discover the irrational number. And the reason being that when you convert arithmetic to geometry, you need to use units. You have to have units. So arithmetic is pure number, but when you have magnitude as geometry with dimensions, you have to have some kind of unit that you're measuring it in. And so you cannot use a proof by contradiction logic, because there's not a one-to-one correspondence between the number and the length. So when you have geometric length, all of a sudden you're fudging your logic with the numbers that you're using in arithmetic. In other words, the square root of 2 does not exist as a unit on its own. It has to have some kind of materialistic dimension to it. And of course, my personal reason for rejecting the Pythagorean theorem was from my music theory training when I was a youngster. And so I knew that there was a secret music origin of the Pythagorean theorem. And if you read Peter Pesach's book that got published by MIT, he explains how, if you have the major second music interval from early Greek science, it was 9/8 as a major second. And in Platonic philosophy, each citizen was valued as a major second music interval, 9/8. And this was explained by Professor Ernest McLean, who said how Plato argued that each citizen must compromise for the good of the state. And by compromise, they mean the music intervals need to be tempered as approximations of logarithms. So when you cube 9/8, you get the tritone, which is the square root of 2. And the tritone is also the most dissonant music interval of the scale, but in Platonic philosophy was also the tyrant. So the idea was that democracy was actually defined by logarithms or what they called a logon being the approximation of the square root of 2. So the earliest irrational magnitude concept was actually in Platonic philosophy. So in my later research, I cite the various philosophers stating that the definition of a pairon was changed by Plato. In Orthodox Pythagorean philosophy, a pairon is the cosmic mother as the emptiness or void that radiates light. So it's the same meaning as in Eastern philosophy. But for Plato, a pairon was changed to mean the Platonic form as the square root of 2, or irrational number. So Sebs Solomon asked me about this in her podcast interview with me. That's still on the internet. It's archived on some other website. It used to be on YouTube, but it got taken down. And I didn't want to go into the details because it's a bit thorny, but basically Aristotle disagreed with Plato about the idea of there being a negative infinity as a materialistic source of reality. And Plato argued that this negative infinity was actually what he called two-ness, and so the two-ness being the Platonic form as the square root of 2. And what it actually means is that there's an inherent symmetric origin of reality in geometry, and therefore time is an image. So to bring that back to the definition of time in Western science, you have this claim that there's 0 dimensions when you're using radians of a circle. And so you have 1 over 2 pi. 1 over 2 pi is the very first wave as frequency, as a angular frequency, as a wave. And as this Greek philosopher points out, the Fourier time frequency uncertainty has to be, it cannot be 0. It has to start with 1. So it's equal to or greater than 1 as time and frequency. And the reason being that you have to have repetition in order to have frequency. You have to have a unit that is a cycle that repeats itself. But the irony with noncommutativity is that, as Yogananda said in Kriya Yoga philosophy, the source of reality is ever new and ever fresh, so it never repeats itself. And this is because of the noncommutativity. So since there's no 0, the unit of the of the one when you're listening to the source of the one, there's no materialistic definition of it. So in ancient Greek philosophy, the one was actually considered to be light as the self. The source of the self was actually light. So you're listening to the one that then turns into light, and so you listen to the source of the light. And this was called the Om of light in Indian philosophy. And so then when the one turns into the 2, what happens is it's actually an infinite spiral. And that's because the 3 then creates this non-commutative ratio to the 2. So the 2 would be, as in the time frequency uncertainty, they point out with the quantum harmonics that the 0 point energy is actually the octave. It has to be the 1 in relation to the 2 because there's no 0. And how that's defined in quantum physics is you have Planck's constant over 2 pi. So the 2 pi is actually the 1 in terms of time and frequency. So the frequency is the 1 over 2, where the Planck's, or 1 over 2 pi, where the Planck's constant is the 1 with no dimensions. So Planck, he canceled out the time of the 2 pi in the units of seconds, and then he for joules to create energy in terms of density. So he's converting the frequency as intensity of energy into density as joules energy by canceling out the time, so you're just left with frequency. So then you get the Planck's equation of energy equals Planck's constant times frequency. So then, in terms of quantum physics, the frequency is directly proportional to the momentum as wavelength. But then it's also inherently non-local, which is the paradox of the particle and the frequency duality and all the mysteries of the double slit experiment. And so what noncommutativity is pointing out is that there's this inherent second time from the future. And this is what you find in music theory, is that if you listen to the source of the one, instead of there being a doubling as a spatial dimension, you have this infinite spiral of time where you're listening. And so the number 3 is actually an undertone and overtone at the same time. So it's, in terms of geometry, it's C to G as 3/2 and then C to F as 2/3. So what happened in order to create the irrational magnitude, what Philolaus did is he flipped his musical instrument around the lyre, and by doing that he could change the 1 as a different definition of 0. So originally he had 0 to 12, and then he changed it to 0 to 8 by flipping his lyre around. And so then he could say, well, okay, 6 to 8 is 3/4, and that of a wavelength as a wavelength, and therefore 8/6 is 4/3. The reason he had to do that is because when you're listening to the source of the one, there's never a overtone of 4/3 because the denominator has to be the same symmetry, or the same doubling as a harmonic of the home tone or root tonic. So when you have 4/3, you have a 3 in the denominator, and so that's non-commutative with the 1 and the 2. So the only way he could create logarithms was to flip his musical instrument around and then just say, okay, it's just a ratio, and a ratio of a ratio is a logarithm, and it does not matter what the time and frequency is, because now it's a spatial dimension. And so it doesn't matter what the direction of listening is. And because you're defining time as an external visual measurement. And therefore you can say the perfect fifth plus the perfect fourth equals the octave, which is the very first logarithmic equation, because then you have 3/2 plus 4/3 equals 12/6. But you're hiding the fact that you've changed the one that you're listening to. So you change the one into being two different definitions of 0. And so this is really the secret of what Plato meant when he said two-ness as the Platonic form. And so you have the square root of 2 is actually this infinite rational number discreteness that's more dense. It's more dense than the space-time continuum of real numbers that's defined by symmetry of the Platonic forms. So it's secretly hidden in the music tuning of Philolaus. And then what Archytas did was use the Babylonian mathematics that says the arithmetic mean times the harmonic mean equals the geometric mean squared. So that again would be the 3/2 times the 4/3, or the perfect fifth times the perfect fourth equals the octave. And as the geometric mean squared, so then you have 2 equals the geometric mean squared. So then the two-ness is actually the square root of 2 as the geometric mean, which is also the tritone. So then what Plato said is that democracy is actually each citizen being compromised for the good of the state as musical harmony, as logarithms. But they didn't use that word logarithm. They just used a logon. And then, so it was no longer the logos by Pythagorean Orthodox philosophy. It was a logon. And then, because each citizen compromised for the good of the state, then you inherently had this inverse exponential growth of wealth for the elite as the inverse of the logarithms. So in terms of music tuning, that's what's called the Pythagorean comma, because you have the perfect fifth against the octave in order to create the 12-number music scale. So you have the 12 notes as each citizen of the state, which you could also call the 12 apostles of Christianity, or the 12 stars of the zodiac, or the 12 the zodiacs. I don't know if there's constellations, but and so then in if you look at the Chinese tuning that I go into in my Ancient Advanced Acoustic Alchemy book, I cite the Chinese cosmology, where they rediscovered this, Pythagorean comma as a difference between the lunar and solar calendar for the music tuning. And so it's based on how they define the lunar calendar and solar calendar. And so basically it gets you into cosmology as well, but then so when we have this ancient philosophy of Platonic, it was used to make catapults, because then once you had an irrational number, you could precisely double the volume, and so basically the major third in music tuning would be 5/4. So what Archytas did was he extended the Pythagorean tetractys of 1, 2, 3, 4, which used to be called the creative fire in alchemy. It's like a pyramid or a triangle. And so when you extend it into a pyramid as 5/4, then you get the cube root of 2. It approximates the cube root of 2. And this was rediscovered by Ficino in the Renaissance. It's described in Stuart Isaacof's book, Temperament. And so that's how you get the rediscovery of science, basically, of the ancient Greeks through the music tuning. And then that leads to the music logarithmic spiral, which is what I discovered right after my master's thesis. And that was a concept coined by Esther Watson Tipple, the daughter of Thomas Watson, who was the co-inventor of the telephone with Graham Bell. And the music logarithmic spiral was the key concept to what I call the actual matrix plan, which was the basis for transhumanism and what was called cosmic humanism by a theosophist-based think tank that was tied to the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton. So Einstein supported it, and it was promoted by Olivier L. Reiser, or yeah, he was a philosophy professor at University of Pennsylvania, and then he corresponded with Andrija Puharic, who was this top level military mind control scientist. So that was what my latest book is about. So I discovered that music logarithmic spiral right after my master's thesis, and Oliver Reiser, he did his PhD on what he called creative monism or non-dualism in action as a philosophy of science to transform the world as some kind of technical spiritual evolution. And it's all based on the structural drive of the mathematics as an expansion of the dimensions of symmetry through the equal temper tuning. And so my argument was that, well, this is all wrong because the truth of music is actually the non-commutativity. So my master's thesis didn't quite grasp the non-commutative concept. I didn't discover it yet in science until right after my master's thesis, when I discovered Alain Kahn. His newest book was Triangle of Thoughts, or I think it's Triangles of Thought. And then it took me another, 15 years to realize that, yeah, Alain Kahn was not being metaphorical. So if you look at his Music of Shapes lecture, he goes into the music theory more, and he ties it back to the transitional frequency analysis of Heisenberg, which brings us right back to the Greek philosopher that I cited, who's pointing out that this transitional frequency of Heisenberg is actually non-commutative. And so the uncertainty principle in quantum physics of momentum and position that originates from the Fourier uncertainty is actually non-commutative non-locality. That's also non-dualism. So that brings us full circle, so to speak. And I'll leave it at that.